Everyone knows farms are big, but what if I told you that some agricultural operations are larger than entire countries, that single cattle stations span territories bigger than nations, and that the world's most massive farms require aircraft just to patrol their boundaries because driving the perimeter would take days? We're not talking about your grandfather's family farm or even the big spreads that dominate American agriculture. We're talking about operations so vast, they challenge comprehension, where tens of thousands of cattle roam across millions of acres, where machinery fleets number in the hundreds, and where the logistics of managing land, livestock, and crops operate at scales that seem impossible until you see the numbers. Today, we're counting down the 12 largest farms on Earth, with mind-blowing facts that prove modern agriculture has reached proportions that would have seemed like science fiction just generations ago. From Australian cattle stations stretching across deserts to Brazilian soybean empires transforming continents, these aren't just big farms. These are agricultural kingdoms that feed nations and that redefine what's possible when land, capital, and ambition combine. This is farming at a scale most people never imagine exists. Number 12, Irandia Farm, Brazil. The Irandia Farm in Brazil takes the 12th position as a massive mechanized farming operation, spanning approximately 1,500,000 acres in Mato Grosso, creating a soybean and grain farm that represents the scale that modern South American agriculture has achieved. The Mato Grosso location places Irandia in the heart of Brazil's agricultural frontier, where vast tracts of land have been converted to mechanized farming, creating the productivity that has made Brazil a global agricultural powerhouse, competing with the United States for dominance in soybean and grain exports that feed the world. The mechanization is total, with fleets of tractors, combines, and specialized equipment numbering in the hundreds, operating across fields measured in thousands of acres, where individual passes can stretch for miles without interruption, and where the logistics of moving equipment, supplies, and harvested crops require coordination that rivals military operations. The soybean production represents Brazil's transformation from a coffee and sugar economy into a diversified agricultural giant, with soybeans becoming the crop that drives expansion into previously undeveloped regions where land prices and development costs allow the scale that Irandia represents. The precision agriculture technology is sophisticated with GPS guidance systems, steering equipment with inch-level accuracy, with variable rate application adjusting seed populations and fertilizer rates based on soil mapping and yield history, and with data collection feeding farm management systems that analyze every aspect of operations, revealing opportunities for improvements that traditional farming relying on experience and intuition could never identify. The fuel consumption is staggering, with the equipment fleets burning thousands of gallons daily during peak planting and harvesting seasons, when machines operate around the clock, and when every hour of downtime represents lost opportunity during the compressed windows that tropical weather patterns impose on operations that must complete work before rains arrive or before conditions change, making fieldwork impossible. The maintenance facilities function as industrial complexes employing dozens of mechanics working multiple shifts, keeping equipment operating through preventive maintenance, during slow periods, and through emergency repairs, during critical seasons when breakdowns can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost productivity if machines sit idle while crops wait to be planted or harvested. The seed purchases represent investments measured in millions of dollars annually, with Irandia buying genetically modified varieties, providing herbicide tolerance and pest resistance that allow reducing chemical applications while maintaining yields that conventional varieties cannot match, despite costing substantially more than traditional seeds. The fertilizer requirements are massive, with the operation applying hundreds of thousands of tons annually, replacing nutrients that intensive cropping removes from soils, with the costs representing major expenses that must be managed carefully because over-application wastes money, while under-application reduces yields, creating delicate balancing that agronomists must calculate based on soil testing, crop requirements, and economic considerations, weighing input costs against expected yield increases. The harvest logistics require coordinating dozens of combines, cutting soybeans simultaneously, with grain carts shuttling between combines and trucks that transport crops to on-farm storage or directly to elevators and ports, where soybeans are loaded onto ships bound for markets across Asia and Europe that depend on Brazilian production for feeding livestock operations and processing facilities, producing oil and meal. The labor force numbers in the hundreds during peak seasons, with operators, mechanics, agronomists, and support staff being housed in facilities that function like small towns, where everything needed for supporting workers must be provided because the remote location makes commuting impossible for most employees who live on site during the intense planting and harvesting periods. The environmental monitoring has increased with pressure from international buyers and environmental organizations requiring documentation that expansion hasn't occurred in protected areas and that operations comply with Brazilian environmental laws that have become more stringent. As global attention has focused on deforestation and land use changes in the Amazon and Cerrado regions, where agricultural expansion has been most rapid and most controversial. The infrastructure required for operating 1,500,000 acres includes grain storage facilities with capacities measured in millions of bushels, transportation networks connecting fields to ports hundreds of miles away, and maintenance facilities that function as industrial complexes keeping equipment operating during the compressed planting and harvesting windows that tropical agriculture imposes. The environmental concerns are substantial, with critics questioning whether the expansion of farming into sensitive ecosystems is sustainable and whether the monoculture approach that operations like Irandia employ creates long-term risks through soil depletion, pest pressures, and the loss of biodiversity that large-scale mechanized agriculture inevitably creates when natural landscapes are converted to uniform cropland. Number 11. Menagazzo Group Farms, Brazil. The Menagazzo Group Farms take the 11th position, spanning approximately 2 million acres across Brazil, creating one of South America's largest agribusiness holdings, combining soybean and cattle farming into integrated operations that maximize land use and profitability. The 2 million acre total represents multiple properties, rather than a single contiguous operation, with holdings spread across regions where soil quality, climate, and infrastructure create opportunities for profitable agriculture at scales that smaller operations cannot achieve. The soybean production dominates, with hundreds of thousands of acres dedicated to the crop that has transformed Brazilian agriculture, and that has made the country the world's largest soybean exporter, competing directly with American farmers for global market share, in a commodity that feeds livestock operations worldwide and that provides oil for food and industrial applications. The cattle component integrates with crop production using pastures and feeding operations that take advantage of the infrastructure and logistics that crop farming requires, creating synergies where land rotates between uses and where diversification reduces the risks that pure crop or pure livestock operations would face from market fluctuations or production problems affecting single commodities. The mechanization mirrors Irandia, with massive equipment fleets, sophisticated precision agriculture technology, and the infrastructure necessary for operating at scales, where inefficiency or poor management would create losses measured in millions of dollars annually. The family ownership creates continuity and long-term planning horizons that publicly traded agricultural companies sometimes lack, when quarterly earnings and shareholder demands create pressures for short-term thinking that can compromise the investments and the stewardship that sustainable agriculture at massive scales requires for maintaining productivity across generations, rather than just extracting maximum profits before moving on. Number 10. King Ranch, USA. The King Ranch takes the 10th position as an iconic American ranch spanning approximately 825,000 acres in Texas, creating a cattle operation that is larger than Rhode Island, and that represents the ranching heritage that built the American West. The Texas location places King Ranch in the state that defines American ranching culture, with the operation being founded in 1853 and surviving through generations of family ownership that has maintained the ranch through economic cycles, droughts, and the changes that have transformed American agriculture from open-range cattle drives to modern mechanized operations. The 825,000 acres create a property that requires aircraft for monitoring and managing, with the distances being so vast that ground transportation alone would be inadequate for overseeing cattle, fencing, water systems, and the 1,000 details that operating a ranch at this scale demands. The cattle operation supports tens of thousands of head, with the King Ranch having developed its own cattle breed, the Santa Gertrudis, that combines the heat tolerance and disease resistance of Brahman cattle with the beef quality of British breeds, creating animals suited for the hot, humid conditions that characterize South Texas. The diversification extends beyond cattle, with oil and gas production from mineral rights, farming operations producing cotton and grain, and hunting leases providing income from the wildlife that the vast, undeveloped spaces support, creating revenue streams that sustain operations when cattle markets are unfavorable. The cultural significance makes King Ranch more than just a business, with the property being recognized as a National Historic Landmark and being featured in books, films, and the American imagination as representing the ranching tradition that defines Texas identity and that connects modern America to the frontier past, when open spaces and cattle operations shaped the nation's development and character. Number 9. Vermejo Park Ranch, USA. The Vermejo Park Ranch in the United States takes the 9th position, spanning approximately 590,823 acres in New Mexico and Colorado, creating a mixed ranching and conservation operation owned by Ted Turner that combines cattle ranching with wildlife conservation, demonstrating that large-scale agriculture can coexist with environmental stewardship. The Ted Turner ownership reflects the media mogul and conservationist's commitment to preserving large landscapes while maintaining economically productive operations that generate revenue, supporting conservation efforts, and demonstrating models for sustainable land use. The 590,000 acre size creates landscapes that support diverse wildlife populations, including elk herds numbering in the thousands, trophy trout fisheries, and the ecological diversity that large undeveloped properties can maintain when management prioritizes conservation alongside economic productivity. The cattle operation provides traditional ranching income while being managed with stocking rates and practices that maintain range conditions and that avoid the overgrazing that has degraded many western rangelands, where short-term profit maximization has compromised long-term sustainability. The habitat restoration projects include reintroducing native plant species, removing invasive species that degrade forage quality and wildlife habitat, and implementing controlled burns that replicate the natural fire cycles that historically maintained grassland health before fire suppression policies altered ecosystems in ways that reduced biodiversity and created conditions allowing woody species encroachment into grasslands that once supported diverse plant communities. The monitoring programs use scientific methods tracking wildlife populations, vegetation conditions, water quality, and the various indicators that reveal whether management is achieving conservation goals or whether adjustments are needed for maintaining the ecological integrity that makes Vermejo valuable beyond simple economic returns from cattle sales and recreational leases. The educational component includes hosting researchers, studying wildlife ecology, rangeland management, and conservation biology, providing real-world laboratories where theories can be tested and where practical knowledge can be developed, informing management on other properties where owners want to balance economic productivity with environmental stewardship. The legacy vision ensures that Vermejo will remain intact rather than being subdivided for development, preserving large landscapes that are increasingly rare in the American West, where population growth and development pressures fragment properties, creating isolated parcels that cannot support the wildlife populations and ecological processes that intact landscapes maintain when protected from the subdivision that destroys conservation values that large properties provide. The conservation focus includes bison restoration, with Turner being one of the largest private bison owners in North America, and with Vermejo supporting herds that represent efforts to restore animals that once dominated Western landscapes before being hunted nearly to extinction during the 19th century. The public access is limited, with Vermejo operating primarily as a private recreational property, offering high-end hunting, fishing, and nature experiences that generate revenue while limiting the human impacts that unrestricted public access would create on ecosystems that require protection for maintaining the wildlife populations and the ecological functions that make the property valuable for conservation. Number 8. Monte Cristo Station, Australia. The Monte Cristo Station takes the 8th position as an Australian cattle station, spanning approximately 2,500,000 acres in Queensland, creating massive grazing land that supports cattle operations in the remote interior, where distances and isolation create challenges that coastal agriculture never faces. The 2,500,000 acres place Monte Cristo among Australia's largest properties, with the station operating in regions where annual rainfall is marginal, where droughts can last years, and where the carrying capacity measured in acres per animal unit is so low that profitability requires vast land holdings that smaller operations could never sustain economically. The Queensland location places Monte Cristo in the state that dominates Australian cattle production, with the property contributing to the beef exports that make Australia a major supplier to Asian markets, where demand for quality beef has grown as incomes have increased and as dietary preferences have shifted toward higher protein consumption. The cattle management requires extensive infrastructure, including thousands of miles of fencing, water points supplied by bores, tapping underground aquifers, and road networks, allowing access to animals that range across territories where natural features and vast distances make locating and working cattle challenging even with aircraft and modern communications. The isolation creates self-sufficiency requirements, with stations needing to maintain equipment, house staff, and operate for extended periods without external support, because the distances to towns and services are measured in hundreds of miles, and because weather or road conditions can make access impossible for weeks during wet seasons, when flooding isolates properties completely. The economic pressures are constant, with cattle prices fluctuating based on global demand, with costs for labor, fuel, and supplies increasing, and with droughts reducing carrying capacity and forcing destocking that can take years to recover from when rains finally return and pastures regenerate, allowing cattle numbers to increase, gradually rebuilding herds that droughts decimated. Number 7. Inaminka Station, Australia. The Inaminka Station takes the 7th position, spanning approximately 3,340,000 acres in remote South Australia, creating a cattle station that is historically important in exploration and that operates in one of the continent's most challenging environments. The 3,340,000 acres place Inaminka among Australia's largest cattle stations, with the property being located in arid regions where summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit and where the harsh conditions test both livestock and the people who manage them. The historical significance includes the property being near the location where explorers Burke and Wills died during their 1860 to 1861 expedition attempting to cross the continent from south to north, creating associations with the exploration history that opened Australia's interior to European settlement and that revealed the challenges that the harsh climate and vast distances imposed on those attempting to traverse or settle regions that Aboriginal peoples had inhabited sustainably for thousands of years. The cattle operation manages animals that must be hardy enough to survive conditions where feed is sparse, where water is scarce, and where the distances between watering points can be tens of miles, requiring cattle to travel farther than animals in more favorable environments would ever need to move for accessing the resources necessary for survival. The infrastructure is minimal compared to coastal properties, with improvements being limited to the essentials, including homestead facilities for staff, yards for working cattle, and the bore-fed water points that provide the only reliable water sources in regions where surface water is ephemeral and where droughts can mean years without significant rainfall. The isolation is extreme, with the nearest town being hours away by vehicle and with supplies, parts, and services requiring planning and logistics that coastal operations never face, because remoteness means that broken equipment, medical emergencies, or simple supply needs become major challenges, requiring aircraft access or multi-day round trips to towns that themselves are small and that don't offer the services that urban areas take for granted. Number 6. Wave Hill Station, Australia. The Wave Hill Station takes the 6th position, spanning approximately 3,300,000 acres in Australia's Northern Territory, creating a cattle station that is famous for the 1966 Gurindji strike that became a landmark in Indigenous land rights movements. The 3,300,000 acres support cattle operations in tropical savanna regions where the wet season brings monsoon rains flooding rivers and making vast areas inaccessible, while the dry season sees temperatures soaring and pastures becoming parched, requiring careful management of cattle movements and water supplies. The Gurindji strike began in 1966, when Indigenous stockmen and their families walked off Wave Hill protesting poor wages and living conditions, with the protest evolving into demands for land rights that eventually resulted in the Australian government returning portions of the station to traditional owners in 1975, marking a significant moment in the recognition of Indigenous land rights that had been denied since European colonization. The cultural significance makes Wave Hill more than just a cattle station, with the property being symbolic of the struggles that Indigenous Australians faced for recognition and justice, and with the station representing the intersection of pastoral industry history and the Indigenous rights movements that transformed Australian society and law. The cattle operation continues alongside the Indigenous land holdings, with portions of the original station remaining as working cattle property, while other areas have been returned to traditional owners who manage land according to cultural practices and priorities that differ from purely commercial pastoral operations. The Northern Territory location places Wave Hill in regions where development pressures are minimal and where vast spaces remain relatively unchanged by modern development, creating landscapes where traditional Indigenous connections to land can be maintained alongside contemporary economic activities. Number 5. Davenport Downs, Australia. The Davenport Downs takes the 5th position as Queensland's largest cattle property, spanning approximately 3,700,000 acres, creating a station that is vital to Australia's beef exports, and that operates in the Channel Country, where the intricate network of ephemeral rivers creates unique grazing conditions. The 3,700,000 acres place Davenport Downs among the continent's most significant pastoral holdings, with the property sporting tens of thousands of cattle that graze native pastures that green after floods, but that become sparse during extended dry periods that characterize the highly variable climate. The Channel Country location creates distinctive management challenges, with the braided river systems flooding during wet years, creating lush pastures that can support high cattle densities, but that can also isolate the station when waters spread across vast areas, making roads impassable and requiring aircraft for access and for monitoring flood extents and cattle distributions. The beef production contributes significantly to Australian exports, with cattle from properties like Davenport Downs supplying both domestic and international markets, where Australian beef commands premium prices based on quality, food safety standards, and the grass-fed production systems that create flavor and characteristics that feedlot beef cannot match. The infrastructure includes extensive fencing, dividing the property into manageable paddocks that can each be thousands of acres, creating areas where cattle can be rotated, allowing pastures to rest and regenerate rather than being continuously grazed in ways that would degrade vegetation and reduce long-term carrying capacity. The staff requirements include stockmen skilled in horseback cattle work, mechanics maintaining fleets of vehicles and equipment, and managers coordinating operations across distances that require sophisticated communications and logistics, ensuring that work is completed efficiently and that problems are identified and addressed before they become crises threatening cattle health or property operations. Number 4. Alexandria Station, Australia. The Alexandria Station takes the 4th position, spanning approximately 4 million acres in Australia's Northern Territory, creating a cattle station that supports tens of thousands of cattle across landscapes where the wet and dry season extremes create management challenges that require experience and adaptation to conditions that vary more dramatically than in temperate regions. The 4 million acres create a property larger than many small nations, with the station operating in remote regions, where the nearest services are hours away, and where self-sufficiency is essential for maintaining operations throughout the year. The Northern Territory location places Alexandria in tropical savanna regions, where monsoonal rains transform dry, dusty landscapes into green pastures almost overnight, but where the wet season also brings flooding, impassable roads, and conditions that make cattle work impossible, requiring all operations to be scheduled around the seasons that dictate what is possible during different times of the year. The cattle breeds are selected for adaptability to tropical conditions, with Brahman influence providing heat tolerance and parasite resistance that British breeds lack, creating animals that thrive in conditions where cattle from temperate regions would struggle to survive. The marketing requires planning, with cattle being moved to railheads or trucked hundreds of miles to processing facilities, with the logistics of transporting thousands of head requiring coordination between the station, transport operators, and buyers who schedule delivery based on processing capacity and market conditions. The economic significance extends beyond the station itself, with Alexandria providing employment in remote regions where opportunities are limited, and with the cattle production contributing to the regional economy through purchases of fuel, supplies, and services that sustain small towns that would otherwise struggle to maintain viable businesses in areas where populations are sparse and where distances limit economic opportunities. Number 3. Clifton Hills Station, Australia. The Clifton Hills Station takes the 3rd position as one of the oldest and largest cattle stations in Australia, spanning approximately 4,600,000 acres in remote desert grazing country, where the harsh conditions and vast distances create challenges that only the hardiest operations can sustain. The 4,600,000 acres place Clifton Hills among the continent's largest properties, with the station operating in South Australia's far north, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and where rainfall is so unreliable that droughts lasting years are normal rather than exceptional, creating conditions where cattle numbers must be flexible, responding to pasture availability that varies dramatically between wet periods and droughts. The age of the station creates historical significance, with Clifton Hills having been established in the 19th century and having survived generations of family ownership, economic cycles, devastating droughts, and the changes that have transformed Australian agriculture from frontier pastoralism to modern mechanized operations using aircraft, vehicles, and communications technology that early station owners could never have imagined. The desert grazing creates low carrying capacities, with the station requiring dozens or even hundreds of acres per animal unit, because the sparse vegetation and low rainfall mean that pasture productivity is minimal compared to higher rainfall regions where single acres can support multiple cattle. The water supply is critical, with the station depending on underground bores tapping the Great Artesian Basin, providing the only reliable water sources in regions where surface water is nearly non-existent, and where bore water quality and quantity determine where cattle can range and how many animals the property can sustain. The isolation requires that Clifton Hills maintain extensive facilities, including staff housing, workshops, storage for supplies that must be purchased in bulk because resupply trips are infrequent, and communication systems that allow connecting with the outside world despite being hundreds of miles from towns or services that coastal Australians take for granted. Number 2, Anna Creek Station, Australia. The Anna Creek Station takes the second position as a cattle station, spanning approximately 6 million acres in arid South Australia, creating a property that is larger than Israel, and that supports approximately 10,000 head of cattle across landscapes, where the harsh desert environment challenges both animals and the people who manage them. The 6 million acres make Anna Creek the world's largest cattle station, with the property being so vast that inspecting boundaries or locating cattle requires aircraft because the distances are simply too great for ground-based operations to cover efficiently or economically. The arid conditions create carrying capacities that seem absurd to people familiar with productive agricultural regions, with Anna Creek requiring an average of hundreds of acres per animal, because the sparse desert vegetation provides so little feed that cattle must range widely for finding adequate nutrition. The cattle operation uses breeds suited for harsh conditions, with hardy animals that can travel long distances between water points, and that can survive on the sparse native grasses and shrubs that characterize the landscape during normal years, and that become even scarcer during droughts that can last for years. The management challenges include the vast distances that make mustering cattle a major undertaking, requiring helicopters, motorcycles, and extensive planning, coordinating crews working across territories, where the scale makes simple tasks complex, and where isolation means that problems cannot be solved quickly through calling for outside help or supplies. The economic viability depends on the scale, with Anna Creek requiring millions of acres to generate the cattle numbers that create viable income, because the low carrying capacity means that smaller properties could not support enough animals to justify the infrastructure, labor, and operational costs that cattle ranching in such harsh environments imposes. Number 1, Mudanjiang City Mega Farm, China. The Mudanjiang City Mega Farm in China takes the top position as the largest farm on Earth, spanning approximately 22,243,200 acres, creating a dairy farm that houses over 100,000 cows and that produces more milk than many countries combined. The scale is almost incomprehensible, with the property covering territory larger than many small nations and representing the extremes that modern industrial agriculture has reached when governments and corporations commit resources to building operations that traditional farming could never approach. The 22 million acre figure represents holdings that dwarf anything in Western agriculture, with the property being so vast that it challenges understanding and that raises questions about how dairy operations could possibly function at such scales, where the logistics of managing that much land and that many animals would require coordination and infrastructure that seems impossible until recognizing that Chinese agricultural development has followed paths that differ from Western models. The 100,000 cows create production capacity that supplies milk to populations measured in tens of millions, with the dairy production being essential for feeding the growing Chinese middle class that has adopted dairy consumption at rates that have transformed global milk markets and that have created demand requiring operations at scales that traditional dairy farms could never satisfy. The industrial nature represents a fundamental difference from family dairy farming, with operations like the Mudanjiang mega farm being managed like factories, where animals are viewed as production units, and where optimization of output, efficiency, and costs drives decisions that traditional farmers who view animals as individuals and who maintain personal connections to herds would find disturbing or objectionable. The environmental concerns are substantial, with the concentration of so many animals creating waste management challenges that require sophisticated systems, preventing contamination of water supplies and soil, with questions about whether such massive operations can be sustainable long-term, or whether they represent short-term thinking, prioritizing production volume over ecological stewardship. The feed requirements for 100,000 cows are staggering, with the operation requiring thousands of acres of crop production, supplying the forage, grain, and supplements that dairy cattle need for maintaining milk production, creating integrated agricultural systems where crops and livestock are coordinated rather than being separate operations. The mechanization is total, with milking facilities, feed systems, waste management, and all operations being automated and computerized, reducing labor requirements and improving consistency, but eliminating the personal animal husbandry that characterized traditional dairy farming, where farmers knew individual cows and where care was based on observation rather than on data collected by sensors and analyzed by computers. The labor force required for managing 22 million acres and 100,000 cows numbers in the thousands, with workers being housed in facilities that function like small towns, where everything needed for supporting the workforce must be provided because the scale and location make commuting impossible for most employees. The milk production, measured in millions of gallons, annually supplies processing facilities that produce dairy products distributed across China's vast population, with the milk being essential for the nutrition programs, food security policies, and the economic development that has lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty during recent decades, when agricultural productivity increases, have freed labor for industrial development, while still feeding growing urban populations. The veterinary challenges of maintaining health in herds numbering 100,000 require sophisticated disease monitoring, vaccination programs, and biosecurity protocols, preventing outbreaks that could devastate production and that could create food safety crises affecting millions of consumers, depending on the milk that operations like Mudanjiang produce. The breeding programs use advanced reproductive technologies, including artificial insemination and embryo transfer, optimizing genetics for production traits, creating animals that produce more milk than traditional breeds, but that may lack the hardiness or longevity that less intensively selected animals maintain through natural traits that industrial production often sacrifices for maximum short-term output. These 12 largest farms on Earth prove that modern agriculture has reached scales that challenge comprehension, with operations spanning territories larger than many nations, supporting livestock populations numbered in tens of thousands, and producing food that feeds hundreds of millions of people across continents. From Australian cattle stations stretching across deserts, to Brazilian soybean empires, to Chinese dairy operations of almost unimaginable size. These farms represent the extremes of what becomes possible when land, capital, technology, and ambition combine, creating agricultural operations that bear little resemblance to the family farms that still dominate the American imagination, but that cannot compete with the scale and efficiency that modern industrial agriculture delivers. The questions about sustainability, animal welfare, environmental impacts, and whether such massive operations represent progress or problems remain unanswered as agriculture continues evolving toward larger scales and greater mechanization that may feed the world, but that also transform relationships between people, land, and the food that sustains us all. Which of these massive farms impressed you most? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe now. More agricultural history and mind-blowing farming facts coming soon.